one point, Tiny Tim was one of the most talked about names in American entertainment. He wasn't just a guest on The Tonight Show. He was a full-on spectacle. Johnny Carson had him on again and again because the audience couldn't get enough of his oddball charm. When he married Miss Vicky live on the show, it became one of the most watched moments in late-night history. However, not long after that, something changed. Carson stopped calling. The invites dried up and people started asking the question, was Tiny Tim banned from the show that made him a star? Let's find out. The night that changed everything. When Tiny Tim first walked onto the set of The Tonight Show in 1968, nobody knew what to expect. He came out holding a ukulele, with long hair draped over his shoulders, wearing a suit that looked like it belonged in another century. His face was tight with nerves, his hands stiff, but the moment he opened his mouth and started to sing, you could feel the room change. He sang the cover of Livin' in the Sunlight, Lovin' in the Moonlight, a song written by Al Sherman and Al Lewis for the 1930 film The Big Pond. Tiny Tim wasn't your regular artist. He had this high, fluttery falsetto that sounded like it was floating in from a phonograph that was left playing in someone's attic. It had its strange charm, and nobody on late-night television had ever seen or heard anything like it. When he finished, the studio audience clapped, but Johnny Carson leaned back in his chair and stared for a second before saying, "That's the damnedest act I've ever seen." He wasn't wrong. The late 1960s were already full of unusual performers like funk and soul music, pop rock, beat, psychedelic rock, blues rock, and folk rock. However, Tiny Tim didn't appear to be a rebel or a rock star. He looked like someone who had wandered in from another era and never quite came back. This was the decade of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Doors. And somehow this tall, ghostly man with a ukulele and a falsetto that seemed stuck in 1915 had managed to grab the spotlight, and not just for being weird. There was something different about him. Contrary to what you might be thinking, Carson wasn't the first major host to bring him on. That happened 2 years earlier in 1966 when Tiny Tim made his debut on The Merv Griffin Show. That show lit the fuse because when it aired, letters flooded in from angry viewers who wanted to know what that thing was on their screen. Surprised? Well, they didn't ask who he was. They asked what he was doing because to some people this may have seemed like some sort of comedy that went beyond the script. Others felt uncomfortable just watching him. But somehow that reaction only fueled the fascination. The more people saw him, the more they wanted to see him again. When Carson brought him on in 1968, it was a risky and smart move. Johnny always knew when to take a chance on someone. Tiny's performance left people confused, but nobody forgot it. When Carson started asking him questions, things just got more fascinating. Tiny explained that he had been singing for over 15 years in almost any place where people would listen. In nightclubs, in homes, for the elderly, in alleys, on sidewalks. If someone asked him to sing, he would. He saw his voice as a gift from God and said it was his duty to use it, even if people didn't understand. He told Johnny that his biggest influence was Henry Burr, a singer from the 1910s who most of the audience had probably never heard of. He said he spent hours as a kid listening to Burr's records on a wind-up phonograph. He talked about other forgotten names too, like Irving Kaufman, Billy Murray, and Arthur Fields, and you could tell those names meant something to him. Then Carson asked him about how he stayed healthy, and that's when things got a little spiced up. Tiny discussed healthy foods in a way no one on TV had ever done. He described his daily routine, mixing sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, and wheat germ in a glass, then topping it all with honey and eating it with a spoon. He believed honey was the base of all life, but not just any honey. It had to be from spray-free blossoms. He said it made his whole body feel alive, and he wasn't joking. Tiny Tim mentioned he loved staying clean inside and out. He emphasized the importance of bathing, not just for hygiene, but also so that people wouldn't be uncomfortable standing next to you. He even joked that if a girl suddenly ended a date, maybe it was because her date didn't use the right soap. Then Johnny asked if he was married. Tiny smiled like a boy with a secret and said no. He said he loved all women, just to look at, of course. Tiny explained that he enjoyed writing poems for them and offering advice on romance, but didn't go on many dates. The reason? Well, he was too wrapped up in sports. He said he followed the Dodgers in baseball and the Maple Leafs in hockey so closely that he didn't have time for anything else. When Carson asked if he would choose a girl over a Leafs game, Tiny didn't even hesitate. He took the Leafs. Before the night ended, Carson asked him to perform one more song, and without hesitation he started chanting, "The birds are coming, the birds are coming," over and over before jumping into a song called "I'm a Nut." He sang about acting like a fool ever since someone said they liked him. The lyrics were weird, childlike, and even sweet. The audience didn't know what to make of it, but they clapped, and Johnny sat there half amused and half mystified. That night, Tiny Tim went from being a total unknown to a national curiosity. However, strange as that moment was, it was nothing compared to what came later. Tiny Tim before fame. Before the world knew him as Tiny Tim, he was just Herbert Corey, a quiet, odd little boy born in Manhattan. He grew up in Washington Heights, a neighborhood tucked up in northern Manhattan, where life wasn't easy, and he didn't exactly blend in. His mother, Tilly, had come to New York from Brest-Litovsk, what we now call Belarus, when she was just a teenager in 1914. She was Jewish. His father, a Maronite Catholic priest, worked in the textile industry. However, Tiny Tim wasn't like other kids. At 5, his dad gave him a wind-up gramophone and a 78 RPM record, Beautiful Ohio by Henry Burr. That one gift changed everything. He played it again and again, and when the needle lifted, he would start it all over. Years later, sitting across from Johnny Carson, Tiny Tim still called Burr the wonderful Henry Burr and said that those old records from around 1915 were what shaped his singing style. By 6, he was picking up the guitar. However, it wasn't just about playing. He was chasing a sound that most people had forgotten about. The war was ending, the radio was changing, but Herbert was diving deeper into the past. He became obsessed with early American music, from the 1900s up through the 1930s. While other kids were outside or trading comic books, Herbert was in the library reading everything he could find about the phonograph industry and those old recording artists, and he would photocopy those sheet music to study at home. School, however, was another story. At George Washington High School, he struggled, and his teachers, alongside his classmates, didn't understand him. After having his appendix removed in 1945, he spent time recovering in his room, reading the Bible, and listening to the radio. Sadly, when he returned to school, things didn't get better. He repeated his sophomore year several times before finally dropping out of school. From then on, he picked up whatever small jobs he could, and none of them lasted because of his personality. In the middle of all that struggle, however, something clicked. While listening to Rudy Valley on the radio, Herbert realized he could sing in a high voice, a falsetto that didn't sound like it should come from him. Yet he liked it. Around the same time, he started teaching himself to play the ukulele using an Arthur Godfrey instruction book. Later, he referred to that whole period of his life as a religious experience. People around him thought he was strange, maybe even troubled. But Herbert wasn't trying to be funny or weird. He was just chasing the only thing that made him feel alive, because that was his world. And for the most part, he lived in it alone. Eventually, Johnny Carson saw him. Everyone who watched Johnny Carson, often referred to as the king of late night, would know that he launched the careers of many performers, especially comedians and musicians. So what happens when The Tonight Show gives you the popularity you never expected? Tiny Tim's broadcasted wedding. By the time December 1969 rolled around, Tiny Tim wasn't just a novelty act people chuckled at. He had become something else entirely. A spectacle, yes, but also a strange icon people couldn't look away from. When Johnny Carson announced on The Tonight Show that Tiny would be getting married live on air, most people didn't know whether to laugh or believe him. A lot assumed it was a joke. However, it wasn't. That night, more than 40 million people tuned in to witness something television had never done before: a real wedding. The NBC studio, usually a place filled with monologues and applause signs, had been transformed into something else entirely: a chapel decorated with flowers. The bride was Victoria May Budinger, a 17 years old and known to the public as Miss Vicky. Meanwhile, Tiny was 37. The age gap between them had already drawn plenty of attention. People had conversations about it within themselves, and some didn't understand what it meant. However, Tiny didn't care. He had never followed anyone's script before, and love was no exception. The ceremony was taped at 6:30 p.m. in NBC's Manhattan studios and later aired from 11:30 p.m. to 1 a.m. In the room, too, sat 268 guests, who were mostly family and friends. What made it more surreal was that Tiny hadn't seen Vicky at all that day. He insisted their first look be at the altar, and he kept his word. NBC had gone all out. Over 10,000 tulips flown in from Holland were arranged to bloom on cue. The studio, totally transformed, looked like a dream someone dared to turn into reality, and at the center of that dream was a young woman walking in on her father's arm. As the cameras gently followed Alan Buddinger, he willfully gave his daughter away. Tiny stood waiting. Reverend William Glennesk from Spencer Memorial Church in Brooklyn Heights led the non-denominational ceremony. When he finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the applause was loud. Then Tiny leaned in and kissed Vicky softly. Later on, Carson invited the couple to his desk for a celebratory toast. Champagne glasses were passed around, but Tiny politely declined. Instead, he poured himself a mixture of milk and raw honey, a tonic he referred to as the Lord's food. He explained the honey had never seen the pot, meaning it was unboiled and untouched. The whole time, Vicky sat beside him, smiling. She didn't say much, but when Johnny asked her how it all felt, she nodded gently. Tiny thanked everyone from Johnny to NBC, the crew, the designers, especially Meryl Sidler, who created the lush wedding set, but most of all, he thanked God. Then came a final surprise. At this point, everybody thought Tiny would be okay with his usual ukulele, but he sat at a small keyboard. This time, he admitted he barely knew how to play it, as he had only started learning recently, but he wanted to sing something special for Vicky, a song he had saved for her. In his warbling falsetto, Tiny sang two songs. One was titled "The Wedding Song for Miss Vicky," written by his friend Mirsovsky. The other, "You Were There." Like violets and roses, our spirits will entwine. I promise I'll be faithful, I promise I'll be true, in honor of your love, in honor dear to you. This song wasn't entirely the perfect rendition, but it was sincere. After the broadcast ended, the couple and a few guests gathered for a small reception downstairs in the NBC building. Press photographers captured the moment, and although no one could understand why a 37-year-old man decided a 17-year-old was his soulmate, they couldn't deny the moment was unforgettable. Tiny and Vicky planned to leave for a honeymoon in the Bahamas the next day, but in keeping with the Old Testament story of Tobias, they would spend the first 3 days apart. That, too, was part of the tradition. Tiny later explained how his relationship with Vicky began. He met Miss Vicky in a Philadelphia department store the previous June while signing copies of his book. The first time he looked at her, he fell in love at first sight. "I really think there has to be love at first sight," he said. "It's just like a hit song. You know it right away." Maybe that's all it was. Yet Tiny Tim's wedding wasn't just strange because it aired live on Johnny Carson or because the age difference was glaring. It was strange because behind all the flowers and cameras, it was already breaking apart. And the truth was that it started falling apart long before they ever said, "I do." Why Tiny Tim married Miss Vicky on Johnny Carson's show? Tiny Tim was a sensation because of his personality. If he entered a room, he sure would stir reactions. He met Miss Vicky on the 3rd of June, 1969, just past noon at Wanamaker's department store. She walked in wearing a gray dress above the knees. She was 17, he said. "I fell for her right there." Her name was Victoria, but as the world came to know her, they referred to her as Miss Vicky, a teenager from Haddonfield, New Jersey. By August, he had already asked her parents for her hand in marriage. He did it at the Steel Pier, and they said yes. He didn't tell anyone right away. Instead, he gave that moment to Johnny Carson. That fall, on The Tonight Show, he told Johnny and the rest of America that they would be getting married around Christmas. Johnny was the one who brought up the idea. He mentioned that there used to be a show called Bride and Groom. However, they've never had a celebrity wedding on live TV. Following that statement, he said if Tiny agreed, they could do it a week before Christmas, since he wouldn't be around during the holiday. NBC would cover the cost, and even Miss Vicky's wedding dress. "I thought to myself, if they're paying for the dress, I would look pretty good to her mother," Tiny said. "I wanted to give her something special, even if things between us were already tense." Tiny Tim, however, admitted it wasn't an easy relationship. He had a wandering heart, which you might all find amusing. "It's hard to live with me," he said. "I'm always dreaming about other women. What's more, even before the wedding was finalized, he nearly ran off with someone else, a girl named Iris. Tiny met her in California and flew her back to New York. She stayed at his mother's house, and he even thought about taking her back to California with him. However, he couldn't do it. Miss Vicky was 17. I would have crushed her. She never would have forgotten it," he said. Their marriage, however, wasn't without fights. They had arguments, and one occurred after he discovered she had been seeing a married man who was one of the Christie minstrels. "I always wanted loyalty in marriage," he said. "Cheating, there's nothing worse." So why did he go through with the wedding after all? She was shy about the whole TV thing, but I think she liked it. "It meant a lot for her and her parents back in Haddonfield," he said. "She didn't love me, I knew that. I told her everything about who I was before we even said I do." Tiny Tim explained that he told her he wasn't easy. He mentioned that he lived by his faith and that Christ was at the center of everything for him, but even that didn't go smoothly. Tiny found out Miss Vicky had been taking birth control, and that made him bitter, but at least she had a child with him. Others, like Miss Jan, his second wife, never had any, and he blamed her for the lies that led to the end of their marriage. "She lied to me, and even now I still love her," he said. "I'd take her back if she just told the truth." However, he didn't blame only her. "I've got faults too," he said. As for Miss Vicky, he said she knew what she was walking into. He even told her mother before the ceremony, "Your daughter doesn't love me, but I'll marry her anyway. I won't be the reason her heart gets broken." So they went through with it. The wedding happened. However, immediately afterward, at the CBS ground floor restaurant, the reception turned chaotic because about 2,000 people crashed the event. In the end, every gift they received was stolen. As for the arguments, well, Tiny Tim and Vicky got into an argument on their wedding night. "And we got into an argument that same night," Tiny said. "If you ever get married, don't fight before the wedding. Like Pastor Vandeman used to say, those fights leave scars. Even the small ones, you remember them." Their honeymoon, however, didn't help much either. "We fought a lot, and I don't think we even slept together for the first 3 days," he said. "I wasn't focused on love. I just wanted the marriage to work. Nonetheless, it didn't." For most of their marriage, Tiny and Miss Vicky lived apart from each other. Yes, the wedding had been a spectacle, but the marriage was fragile from the start, and they divorced 8 years later. After Vicky, Tiny married in 1984 to Jan Alweis. Then in 1995, he married again, this time to Susan Marie Gardner. Susan was 39, a Harvard graduate, and had been a fan of his since she was 12 years old. That unforgettable moment when America watched Tiny Tim promise to love a girl who he claimed didn't love him back was the one people never forgot. After the wedding, however, there was a noticeable decline in Tiny Tim's career. The unfortunate decline. After the wedding, things slowly faded. Tiny Tim wasn't filling up big stages anymore, and the TV appearances just weren't coming like they used to. But he kept going, playing concerts wherever he could, and still pulling in some good money, even in places like Las Vegas. In August 1970, he stood on a stage in front of 600,000 people at the Isle of Wight Festival in England and sang, "They'll Always Be in England." Then things started falling apart. In 1973, a driver had a heart attack and crashed into Tiny Tim's van. The accident left him badly hurt, resulting in a collapsed lung, broken ribs, and a 4-month stay in the hospital. As a result, he was unable to go on tours and work. So the money stopped. His manager left, and a career that once touched stardom now felt stuck in place. When his contract with Reprise ended, he started his own record label, calling it Vic Tim Records, a play on his name and that of Miss Vicky's. During an interview, when he was asked what he had been doing since those early years, Tiny said, "Since 1970, it's been a roller coaster that never really went up. I played a few good places, but Vegas was gone. The last big show there was in 1970 at the Fremont Hotel. Helen Reddy opened for me that night. My manager, Roy Silver, had already left the business. I never saw my money." Later in the interview, he admitted that he started working on smaller gigs, moving from Brooklyn to Jersey. He even played the Continental Baths, a gay bathhouse where Barry Manilow opened for him. He went on Carson's show one more time in 1971, but after that, things got slower. From 1974 to 1983, he toured with what he called has-been acts. People like Norman Brooks, George Gobel, Sherman Helmsley from the Jeffersons, Eddie Fisher, Jack Carter, Pinky Lee, and John Carradine. They traveled by bus, stayed at Holiday Inns, left early, did a show, packed up, and moved on, day after day. Then he started going to Australia, which he did about 10 times. However, one of the strangest chapters of this phase was the circus. In 1984, Johnny did a 2-week run with Alan C. Hill's Great American Circus. That turned into a full gig, and he joined them again in 85 and 87. It wasn't entirely the kind of show that would bring in the bulk of money. They worked from March to November, city after city, waking up at 5, back in bed by 11, then back on the road. He followed pony acts, performed 10-minute sets, and ate bad food. He said drifters worked the kitchens and the food was generic. There were gorillas, bears, gypsies, but the circus gave him something no one else did. What's more, Alan Hill helped prove that someone like Tiny Tim could still matter before his divorce from Vicky. He and Miss Vicky had moved to Brooklyn in 1971 after their daughter Tulip was born. They had 7 rooms, but 3 weren't even furnished, and Vicky was unhappy. It was during this time that Tiny knew the end was coming. During the decline of his career, going back to his old neighborhood didn't help. His mother still lived at 601 163rd Street. Now, no one asked for his autograph. This time, it was just his love for sports that kept him going. He admired players like Maury Wills, Billy Martin, Ed Stanky, and Carl Furillo. These were individuals who gave it their all. That's how Tiny saw himself too. You fall, you get back up. You take the good with the bad. The worst part of it all, he said, wasn't the career stuff. It was the romances that didn't last. Miss Vicky, Miss Jan, none of it stuck. And I know a lot of that was my fault too. When asked for any last thoughts, Tiny just said, "In this business, you're either up or down. There's no middle. I'll keep pushing for the top as long as I'm breathing. You gotta believe in your dreams, not your fears. No tassel without a hassle. And the only way to make it is to be yourself. That's all you can do. The rest is in God's hands." Perhaps it was this unyielding drive that also played a role in his demise, the demise of Tiny Tim. On September 28, 1996, Tiny Tim gave what was one of his final interviews. It was filmed at the Montague Book Mill, a spot in Massachusetts. Not long after that, during a ukulele festival at the nearby Montague Grange Hall, something went wrong. Tiny suffered a heart attack and was rushed to the Franklin County Medical Center in Greenfield. The doctors kept him there for 3 weeks because he had a weak heart. The results revealed that he had diabetes. When they eventually let him go, they gave him clear instructions not to perform again, but Tiny didn't listen. On the 30th of November, just 2 months later, he was back on stage. This time it was a benefit event held by the Women's Club of Minneapolis. He told his wife, Miss Sue, that he wasn't feeling well, but he didn't want to cancel the event because he thought he would let everyone down. By the time he went on stage, most of the crowd had already left, yet he still performed. He made it through most of the set, and when he began his final number, his old hit, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, his body gave out again. Miss Sue, who was around at the time it happened, ran to his side and asked if he was okay. By the time she helped him return to their table, he had collapsed and never woke up again. Paramedics tried everything from CPR to revival attempts at the hospital, and nothing worked. At 11:20 p.m., Tiny Tim was pronounced gone at Hennepin County Medical Center. He was 64 and was later buried at Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, inside a mausoleum. Following his demise in 2000, Rhino Handmade released Tiny Tim live at the Royal Albert Hall, a concert he gave back in 1968. Then in 2009, I've Never Seen a Straight Banana, Rare Moments. Volume 1 came out. It was a mix of rare songs Tiny had recorded in 1976, while the rest were from the late 1800s and early 20th century. Justin Martell, one of the people who knew Tiny's life better than anyone, spent years researching his story. In 2016, he published a full biography called Eternal Troubadour: The Improbable Life of Tiny Tim. Martell also worked on several music reissues, including Tiny Tim, Lost and Found from 1963 to 1974, which featured rare and unreleased tracks. In 2013, another book was released, Tiny Tim, Tiptoe Through a Lifetime, written by Lowell Tarling and illustrated by Martin Sharp, offered fans a unique glimpse into his world. Around that same time, an old 1974 live recording was pressed onto a limited edition wax cylinder. The song, Nobody Else Can Love Me Like My Old Tomato Can. Then in 2020, Swedish filmmaker Johan von Sydow released a documentary called Tiny Tim, King for a Day. It looked at his rise, his struggles, and what he left behind. So, was Tiny Tim truly banned from Johnny Carson's show? Well, he had his moments. Yes, he was strange, but people watched. However, as the 70s drew to a close, preferences started to shift, and what the audience found exciting was no longer so. What do you think about Tiny Tim's life? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, explore the other videos on your screen.